Hello, today's video will be the third and the last episode of CPM Mtember, where I will present to you how I remembered CPM. First of all, I have to say that I haven't used CPM in its heydays. I have used it long past its prime years in early 2000s. But I have had a very interesting experience of trying to run it and also trying to understand its rightful place in computing history. And I would like to share with you my thoughts on this. So first of all, let me start the emulator and show you at least something related to CPM, and then I will present more as we go along. So first of all, let's run CPM. Okay, so my first experience of seeing or hearing about CPM, it was, I think, around 1993, 1994 or so. I had a manual for a Commodore 128. The manual was in German and I wasn't able to understand much of it. However, there were some very interesting aspects. First of all, I have noticed that there was so much talk about an operating system, about commands, about things that were happening on the screen, and those were totally different from how you would typically run a program. And I thought long about this and went back and forth trying to find out more about this mysterious program that you could use to run other programs, because this was my understanding back then. However, I have not obviously been able to run that operating system because I was missing some disks. I was missing even a floppy disk drive, and just as well my Commodore 128 that I had back then didn't have the necessary peripherals in order to make this a possibility. So everything about running CPM was totally out of discussion. However, I remembered I was mesmerized about the simplicity and the logic in this system. It was something similar to using a programming language, in that you would ask the computer to do certain things and then some of these were returned to you. And it seemed that you could write and read data in a way that would be much more logical and faster than I would expect. So these were my initial memories of first seeing or learning about CPM. Later on, of course, as it was common in the early 90s, I learned about MS-DOS. When I learned about MS-DOS, there were again some details pertaining to syntax, some aspects that you could have been interested in finding and seeing how you could handle certain tasks. But this was somehow in around 1996. Of course, I had only my first experience of seeing MS-DOS, and later on in 1997, 1998, I got to be quite comfortable in using and interacting with MS-DOS. However, I still had the concept of seeing what CPM was about. I had a ZX Spectrum clone that I used around this time in 1998. However, despite the fact that there were some mentions in the manual, again I was missing some peripherals and even the CPM disks themselves. So I was not able to see how CPM would operate even back then, but I would have more insight into the fact that there was another computer that could run CPM. However, as I got used to seeing all these details, I noticed that CPM and MS-DOS were very similar. Obviously, I wondered which one was first and why it happened for the two of them to be so close to each other. Of course, I wasn't able to have an answer back then either, so some years have passed. I had used that ZX Spectrum clone for quite a while, doing very simple programming in BASIC, but this one didn't have much connection to the current subject at hand. So later on, when I had a problem with that computer, and I have to say that it was due to a mistake I made in powering once and modifying something about that computer, I got to reach the original Romanian manufacturer of that computer, and I found out very interesting aspects. The first of one being the fact that, of course, it was a computer that could run CP/M, and I have seen it run its CP/M. Of course, it was a computer that was severely modified. It had a different interface, it had some sort of peripherals that were added to it, and this meant that it had to operate in a way that was particularly difficult for me to achieve with the configuration I had. Of course, some peripherals could have been purchased, but this was obviously beyond the means I had back then. However, it was a very interesting insight into the fact that I could see more of the computer capabilities in terms of running programs off the floppy disk, and I heard that CP/M could have been run. Again, some time has passed and an opportunity arose, and this meant that I was able to have a full computer that had the necessary interface and that also had a floppy disk drive. It was 3.5-inch floppy disk drive, so it was quite modern, and again, much too late in the system's evolution. I think that such a computer would have been presented to consumers around 1991, 1992, but it was a very expensive configuration because you would have additional capabilities that were presented due to this interface. You could have sort of networking system that you could use, a local network system. You could have the floppy disk drive, and probably it was not that difficult to use even a printer. So it was a computer that in many ways was far above what I had before. And obviously, since I had the floppy disk drive and I did not have any sort of floppies, I wondered if I could see the system. And obviously this was possible. And through an opportunity, I was able to have a set of floppy disks as was sold with the system back in 1991 or 1992. And this brought to me the surprise of being able to run CP/M. And I have to say that it was a real surprise, because I noticed that just about everything about the computer would change. In some ways, it was the missing link between 8-bit computers that were only running games and probably an occasional application like RStudio or Tasman Word, but that was just about the limit of things you would see with such a computer. You would have to have a different, more modern computer that was obviously at least 16-bit capable, running MS-DOS, and then you would see applications that probably were very well known to many persons, like Word and Excel and others. And of course, since I wasn't even working or interacting with computers back when such programs were still used in DOS and they were used in Windows, there was again another time period that was out of my initial experience. However, all these were considered by me as being missing links in a very important computing history that I would have liked to have access to. And this meant that later on, I tried to use Word for DOS, I tried to use various other applications, and got to understand better what happened. Of course, I heard about Multiplan, I heard about Lotus 123, and other applications that made a splash, of course, in the early MS-DOS years. However, there was still this missing link that I mentioned, the one of CP/M and applications that were available for CP/M. And even though I do not have very many applications to show to you, and I'm just presenting to you a listing of what is stored on drive A, I thought about running and seeing how I could work with certain applications. Of course, I was missing some manuals, so most of the attempt, or let's say most of the idea of trying to understand how I could do certain aspects. Of course, back then I didn't have a manual, and even on the internet I could not find, or I could not, I wasn't able to find information that was relevant to running CP/M. So ultimately, when I tried to run CP/M, I had to rely mostly on the way in which I knew things from DOS. And this was not, as far as I can tell and as far as you can guess, a problem, because most, or at least some of the commands can be found quite easily. And since I had to run just specific programs and then understand how the system works, it was not as difficult to make myself in the know just by working with something. And I noticed some interesting aspects. Of course, my first curiosity was to run a dir command and see if it is as similar to DOS as I was expecting. And luckily it was. Then I thought about running applications, and I ran just about every application, including ones such as pip, date, and others that were put on the disk. And notice that they offered specific functionality. And one of the applications that I stumbled upon was WordStar. And I remember I was very surprised at seeing how WordStar worked. And I was particularly noticing the fact that you would have a system that was similar to how a typical text editor would work. Of course, it was much more limited, but there were some advantages in trying to use it. And the first and the most obvious one was the fact that commands were clearly presented, what you could do at each and every point in your application. So for a person that was ultimately a beginner in using those applications, this was highly useful. And I noticed that on the listing of files that were present on the application, just as you would see right now, there were some text files. And I started to wonder what would happen if I would try to open such a file. And one of them, obviously, believe it or not, was a manual. And seeing that manual, I was able to understand what I could do with the system and what I could do with this particular installation that I had in front of me. And I was surprised that so many applications that made a large difference in using computers and had a long history, such as WordStar, Multiplan, the precursor of Microsoft Excel, and the base, which was a database application, all of them were stored, of course, on multiple floppy disk drives, on multiple floppies. And ultimately I could go and switch to one floppy or another, and I learned all of these aspects mostly from the manual. There were some things that were not covered, like how I would create system disk, how I could be able to make some configuration changes. However, those were probably things that I would not be encountering immediately. And this was what mattered, that I was able to see how those applications were running. And of course, the first aspect that I noticed was that it was very difficult to use the system with just the computer with just a single floppy disk drive. And I understood later on, when looking at some CP/M machines, why they were being sold with 2 disk drives. And of course, I had the chance of using a high density floppy disk drive, one that was 720 kilobytes in size, and this was massive, because your typical CP/M installation would run probably with 180 or 360 kilobyte capacity drive. And this was common even for DOS systems of that era. I mean, we are talking about 1981, 1983, and this was roughly the possibility of computing back then. Since I had a 720 kilobyte capacity on a floppy, I was already way above the conditions and limitations that were present back then. So from the start, I was trying to make or trying to solve various issues from the perspective of a modern computer that had obviously a hard disk drive and wasn't as limited as those systems were in terms of disk space. But I understood, due to these capacity limitations, why you would be better off with a dual disk drive. You could have your operating system on one of these drives, and the second one would be for your application. You have to understand that the way in which a CP/M or early DOS computer would be used would not be to have all the applications installed and all of the applications readily available. You would have 1 or 2 applications at most you would probably be using, like a word processor and a spreadsheet application, or a word processor and a programming language. And then you would be able to run these by swapping floppies. And this meant that the way in which you would expect to work with such a system was totally different than the one I was familiar with, like having all the applications installed, like as mentioned, and having enough capacity to work with these applications. Of course, I had the experience of using smaller capacity disk drives, but this was not something that was as limited as back then. I mean, probably my only experience of trying to use a very small disk drive was something around 20 megabytes, and this wasn't on my computer, but was on another computer that I noticed, an IBM PC compatible. I think it was a Tandy 286. And this one, as far as I can tell, probably was a 10 megabyte disk drive that could have been compressed to reach almost twice the size. And later on, I have noticed only the problem of trying to use a computer with an 80 megabyte disk drive, and this was in Windows 3.1 and Microsoft Office 4.3 days. So even if I experienced it much later, this was my benchmark, my reference. This meant that when I tried to run multiple applications, I was obviously seeing the limitations of the system, and I had to find very innovative ways, not necessarily innovative for me, in order to have some of those applications I enjoyed the most on a single disk drive, and then be able to also store some files where I made certain attempts at using the computer for various purposes. And this was how I was able to do all of those tasks that I had set for myself. And this meant that using such a computer was acceptable. Of course, later on, I tried to see if the format of the floppy disk I was using was somewhat similar to the one in MS-DOS, and to my surprise it wasn't that different, but of course I could not have accessed files. I noticed that there were some similarities, and even I could use a program in order to duplicate a CP/M disk. I think it was Maxi disk, I don't remember exactly. A program that you could be using to create a special disk format that you could reach to almost, I think, 1.6 megabyte in size, compared with your typical 1.3 megabytes you would have available after you would format a standard DOS disk. And this program also had the ability of writing and reading disk images. And I was able to duplicate successfully even system disk using such a program. And I was surprised because all of this functionality meant that there was much more to the system that I could experience and that I could understand. And obviously, later on, I tried to see all of these applications, and I got to some very interesting results, noticing the fact that, of course, using an 8-bit computer was not as limiting as you would think, because ultimately the software was the culprit. And the inability of running certain programs was not due to inherent limitations in the 8-bit processor, other than speed and probably program's complexity, but everything that you could do so easily on a modern 16-bit computer or 32-bit computer, you could have been doing on an 8-bit one. The only problem was that you would not know what applications to use. You did not have the software you would be trying to use, and of course you would not be aware of how you can work around some limitations. Okay, I have shown to you this listing, but since I will talk a bit also further, I would like to show you a particular file I prepared so that we would have at least discussion on something, or at least something to present to you. Okay, I'm making some attempts at running a file, but I noticed that the program might have had been stuck. So, okay, right now it showed some command being executed. All right, so I think that this one is the file. It's just going to show something as I'm talking further. So I was able to see most of what CP/M was about. This file will present some minute details that might be interesting to some of you, as far as I could, let's say, summarize them. Sorry. So first of all, how was my experience in using CP/M? I think that it was a very interesting experience because ultimately I have only heard about programs such as Lotus 123 and about the fact that Microsoft had a lot of insight and software it released, not only in programming languages. That was obviously quite a big splash, meaning that they had a lot of profits due to selling programming languages such as BASIC. In fact, many computers had a BASIC program that was supplied by Bill Gates and the Microsoft entity. But later on, there were also certain software packages that were very interesting. One of them was Multiplan. Multiplan was a spreadsheet application that you would have been surprised. It had so many things in common with later versions of Excel. And this meant that when you were trying to see some of the functionality you were all too familiar with on a typical MS-DOS or Windows computer, you would notice that the same capability was available, more or less, of course, without fancy clipboarding functions that obviously were not available even in DOS. Without that multi-application capability, but everything about the basic functionality, like making specific calculations, trying to show information in a certain way, using text and comments, just about everything. Even if it was clumsier in many ways, it would have still been possible to see. Of course, we have to understand the context over here. Those are applications that were delivered in the first half of 1980s. Of course, the second half, with improvements in graphics capability, meant that most of what we got accustomed to in terms of capability was much enhanced. However, the first programs did not have a menu or something that was somewhat similar to this. And this meant that everything pertaining to running an application was mostly about having a manual, understanding some shortcut keys, and then getting very well accustomed to them. However, everything that happened could have been replicated. And this was fantastic because in terms of productivity, you have to understand the context we had in 1990s. In many ways, we were under these, let's say, myth concepts, like having a PC was a mandatory solution to handle just about anything that was computing related. It was not wrong in many ways, because you would be having a much more serious capability than you would have with typical older computers. However, I think that some years before IBM PC compatibles were much more affordable, we would have been better off using some of these capabilities and understanding about them in order to have a better perspective on what could have been done. And I think that this is important, because ultimately, when we're looking at particular functionalities, we should have a much more balanced expectation. And I think that this was what was ultimately missing from our perspective. And of course, the fact that in general, when you were learning about computing history, everything would be about the current systems. This was not bad in itself, because ultimately those systems would be understood, but you would not have the necessary exposure in order for you to understand general computing goals. Like you would have, of course, you would receive this, let's say, basic training that would show that, of course, there were inputs, outputs, you would have peripherals. However, everything stopped at that level, because ultimately, when you would have to handle certain tasks, it was not presented to you how those tasks would be generally handled. I mean, what kind of commands could elicit a particular response in a specific operating system, and how that interactivity could reach a certain result. And I think this was the most important shortcoming you would see, because if you would get accustomed to using DOS or Windows back then, and even probably up to now, you would be having quite a good performance in handling specific tasks, but you would not be prepared to using other systems, to using other ways of interacting with information. And I think this was the most important thing that was lacking. And in many ways, CPM was similar, because not discussing about it just about on any occasion would mean that you would have so much that would be made unavailable to you, because you would see some things, but you would not understand the purpose. And you would listen about large American companies being strongholds in terms of software capabilities, but you would not understand how they got to be in that place. And in the early days of computing, or at least in the early days of personal computing, you would be exposed to these particular software programs that were very telling about what later became a very profitable enterprise and how everything changed in terms of how we perceive this. And I think that this was the most important aspect you could grasp by using CP/M and by using various programs, because it was the missing link that made you understand that there was something in between what we understood at that time as DOS and what became later on a staple of computing. And I think that in this respect, CP/M was a fantastic experience, and using CP/M programs, because I had the chance of doing so some years before, and even on a real machine, not on an emulated one, was an experience in itself. Of course, scrolling, as you have noticed also over here, is not particularly fast. I am not using any sort of acceleration in order to make these tasks faster, other than the CP/M loader that may have a certain influence even in WordStar. But other than that, it's the out-of-box experience. When running CP/M, I was seeing a monochrome monitor. Of course, this was typical back then. Even if this is in color, actually, there are just two colors. It's a foreground and a background color. Nothing else, nothing fancier than that. So most of what the interaction, most of what can be considered an interaction is made through very simple text-based interfaces. You do not have menus as you see on other programs that were typically much later designed, although I don't think it's particularly impossible to create a menu system and show it on the screen, even with limitations that were posed on CP/M and let's say on the way in which the configuration and capabilities are being exposed. Because most of what you see can be created in a certain way, and most applications that used menus actually did not use graphical modes but just text modes, and they were very careful in how they were presenting the text data so they could create the interface. So these were more or less my ideas pertaining to CP/M. There was also another layer that focused on how you could better understand what you were seeing. Ultimately, that applications, programming languages, and just about anything else could be possible. And I think that in this case, even using the 8 characters file name with 3 letters extension was also something you would come to expect from such a computer. And you would be surprised when the same convention was used later in MS-DOS. Actually, MS-DOS was not a creation that came out of nothing. Bill Gates searched for an operating system that could be delivered to IBM, and since he was very resourceful, he found out a company that was developing a clone of CP/M, and since he got a very good deal for that particular operating system, he was very confident in securing the deal with IBM. Actually, he secured the deal with IBM even before he had that clone ready, because he knew that either there was the option of purchasing one or releasing one on a very tight schedule. And he was prepared to take on these challenges much more than digital research. And digital research, even if was the original developer of CP/M, was not that interested or that hopeful that IBM's new PC that would be launched would be so successful. And since the relationship with IBM seemed way too constraining, and digital research did not see potential in computers, they were missing that opportunity. And later on, it was the move that really made digital research obsolete, because they could not bank on such an opportunity, and later on they failed in other ways. But this would have been the moment where Microsoft would have probably been just another software provider, a successful one, but far from the global massive influence that it has right now. And digital research would probably be still releasing operating systems and working in various software and cloud applications. But history was changed, and this is important just because Microsoft was much swifter, and it settled on a deal, and later on was able to follow through by releasing something in due time, as IBM was interested to do. And you have to understand the context of IBM and releasing the IBM PC. IBM was feeling a lot of competition and was fearing the fact that if it would not create a standard that would be held by them, and one that would still make them relevant, would be a massive impact on their business. And later on it was proven that although the PC market was not huge, it meant a massive presence that ultimately shaped the way in which we see computing today. And this was the ultimate staple of what happened. And in retrospect, I can see why CP/M failed so spectacularly, just because it was not maintained properly, it was not having the same, let's say, commitment as it was with MS-DOS. And all of these meant that ultimately CP/M ended prematurely its life in 1983. Applications like WarStar and others were released up until 1987. So despite the system's age, there was still a market, but this market was totally left out of any serious attempt at unifications. And I think that digital research made a horrible mistake in not having the foresight of fighting further this struggle in computing. But ultimately, I came to see and understand that what was possible with MS-DOS entirely could have been possible with CP/M, even if CP/M would not be having major improvements, but was maintained. And this was a staple of what we consider today a given, that computing could be so stable. But the truth is that computing could have been stable even back then if there was a massive interest of at least a party in unifying those standards and trying to offer something. Microsoft in some ways was partially successful in creating a standard on the Japanese market. But this is a story that focuses on some other aspects and probably is better left for another discussion. The MSX standard was a Microsoft initiative that tried to create a common standard for 8-bit computers with the goal of also creating such an environment in America, in Europe, and in other countries. However, it was successful only in Japan because Japan had a particular situation that was fruitful for such an endeavor. Most computer manufacturers were much more interested in trying to create a common standard. In comparison with most European and American manufacturers that were trying to focus on their own goals. And this meant that it showed again how important a standard would be. Of course, digital research could have been in that position, but it wasn't. And later on, everything that Microsoft grasped to do these attempts at creating a common standard were fruitful, and later became the staple of the rise, of the fantastic rise of Microsoft in the early 90s and up to the early 2000s. And I think that CP/M in many ways was the missing link, was the fantastic option that could have been, and of course, obviously it wasn't. Something that was set aside, but shows that bits, memory size, and just about anything that you would consider as being critical to a computer, even keyboards, was not something that would have been impossible to achieve. And you have to think that even keyboard functions such as backspace, cursor keys, and just about anything else could have been implemented even on 8-bit computers if there was a standard that was being promoted heavily by a software company that was in a good position to create a standard. And digital research clearly was. Unfortunately, this did not happen, and we got to see 8-bit computers mostly only as gaming platforms. And it's unfortunate because a lot of potential was being lost, and just about any discussion about serious computing was started only at 16-bit computers, and due to IBM, MS-DOS, and everything that became part of that synergy, when in truth it wasn't a correct perspective. Everything that could have been done on the 16-bit computer, the 16-bit IBM PC, could have been done on 8-bit computers up to a point. And of course, everything was possible. However, the difference in perspective, in price, in marketing preferences, even of computer manufacturers, meant that all these possibilities that were major opportunities were set aside. And I think that this is the reason why CP/M was almost forgotten, although I think it had its own place in history. And I think that this should have been something that is correctly remembered. And I hope that this short video, where I presented some of the aspects that I consider to be essential in CP/M's, let's say, late perspective, are very good to know. Of course, yes, there are many aspects that should have been said further. However, I think that we are almost at the end. I hope that this foray into CP/M 8-bit computing was a very pleasant way in which you could consider how we should better understand where we are today in computing capabilities, have a better grasp of history, and ultimately understand that everything that occurred was not due to, let's say, some sort of hardware capability or something related to a particular design that was a given. No, it was a set of factors that ultimately went on and created a particular environment that made it possible for a certain activity to flourish and another one to perish. And I think that this is the lesson I presented. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Perhaps it was a bit boring. Hopefully not. There are some aspects that you could probably understand through looking at other resources. However, I hope I made a good point about what was the subject. So thank you very much for watching, and if you like the video, please subscribe to the channel and also leave comments. Thank you very much. Have a pleasant day.